you for the warm introduction. I'd like to thank everybody at ASA for bringing me out here and setting everything up for the travel. It was all fantastic. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the archaeological sites that I'm talking about today were left behind by Indigenous people whose descendants currently reside within the Northern Great Plains and adjacent lands. And I hope everybody has a good time during this presentation. If you do have questions during my talk and want to go for those, feel free. There will be a question period after. But I look forward to talk to you all about food and what we can learn from it and how we can look at human decision making from the materials that we're finding. So a little bit more about my story and why I started to think about archaeology the way I do. I grew up on a farm. I wasn't very good at it, so that's part of the reason why I'm in archaeology now. But we did notice things as we were working the land, and I was really interested in the story behind those items, where they came from, who made these, and what was the history behind that. So I grew up in a very rural small town in Manitoba. If you think about a small town, just divide that in half and you'll get the town that I'm from. But I was always interested in the past. When I was at a young age, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So this is one area that has led me to looking at food, because food had made such an important role on the decisions I was making at the time. How much food I can eat, when I need to take my medicine, and what types of food. So as I was working at Brandon University and learning from the instructors there, I had the privilege to work with Dr. Bev Nicholson, who unfortunately passed away recently. And he always taught me about the lessons we learn from the materials that we find. That each item that we find in the ground has a story connected to it. So when we lift those items from the ground, we're actually peeling back layers and identifying things that were connected to those items. And as anthropologists and archaeologists, a big part of our goal is to understand those connections and tell stories about them. So I really renewed my passion for archaeology, took off from there, and I moved to my master's at Lakehead University and started thinking about food cuisine and in the archaeological record. And I had the good fortune to work on a few sites where we were finding a lot of lithic materials, a lot of stone materials, where we were finding large caches of material that were being built for another mode of food production. I started out looking at bison kill sites in Manitoba, and now I'm looking at stone tools and how people were looking at one mode of production. Finding items like this and thinking about the stories that were involved in this. This item was being used for a specific task, for preparing materials for individuals. And this led me into working with more belongings in this region that we all call home. And thinking about food in my own background brought me to examining the Northern Great Plains. And when we think of the Northern Great Plains, we tend to think of these vast open landscapes. Bison often come to mind. And we know that the plains is a vast environment, full of lived experiences. People have been living here since time immemorial, and archaeologists have been studying here for over 100 years. But there's still many gaps in our knowledge, specifically focused around food. So tonight I'm going to focus on a brief window of the plains, which included the arrival of pottery, and this occurred in archaeological traditions that we name Besant, and Avonlea. So the period that I'm talking about tonight is a period of change. Close to 2,000 years ago, material culture known as Besant is found in the archaeological record. The Besant phase was originally named by Boyd Wetlaufer in the 1950s during excavations of the Mortlat site in Saskatchewan. And this period of time is renowned for these short, broad projectile points, which were connected to atlatl technology, so spear throwing, using stick devices to increase the leverage and strength of a throw. How many people have thrown an atlatl dart before? Quite a few. And it is an interesting way of hunting for us now. We tend to think bow and arrow technology, but this is something that people were using for a long period of time and were masters at this craft. So atlatl hunting styles were being used, and then pottery also arrives within this time period. And working with youths and volunteer experiences, I get the good opportunity to work with young individuals and teach them about hunting with atlatls. And to some outsiders, it may seem less efficient than a bow and arrow. And in some respects, it might have been. But working with outreach programs today, I'm often surprised how quickly individuals pick up this technology. And only can imagine how efficient people would have been at this in the past, thousands of years ago, growing up with this technology, as this would have been a part of daily life. And the fun that people have when learning new technology. It often revolves around people trying to throw it as hard as they can and competing with one another. And at one of these events, I had individuals out in the field, we're throwing spears, what could go wrong? And I look out of the corner of my eye and a police officer was nearby, and I'm standing here with a bunch of darts and students, and they're probably asking questions. But really the only question was, can I actually try too? Which is the thing about archaeology and the excitement that we can bring to individuals if they're learning about the past by living it. And you can imagine the excitement and the joy the 13-year-old boys had watching and giving this individual a hard time if their throws were further. So at Pottery and Besant, this is new technology coming in. This is something that wasn't used before in this period of time in the plains. Brian Scribe's work on this tradition provided it with a name, which is Cree for the first potters of the plains. And the first pots found within this region were well made. These were not experimental devices. These are devices that look quite similar to the ones being used further south in Nebraska. They're very infrequent in the archaeological record. These are showing up at maybe 1 out of 100 Besant sites. And when they do show up, they're in a low number. There's a limited number of these pottery vessels found. And if you were to examine the surface expression of these vehicles, it's quite varied. A lot of these are cord marked, but the decorations and styles and shapes have some variation to them. Distinct styles seem to be not present yet, and it's more flexible. So pottery is one change. Another change revolves around food production and revolves around the size of housing structures. During this time, and based on the research by Aileen Riley, a U of A master's student, analyzed how many bison hides would be required to make teepees at this time. And what's interesting during the time of Besant and Sonota is the number of hides drastically increases compared to other time periods, to the estimation of 22 to 53 hides being required for some of these structures. So the sizes of dwellings increased during this time period as well. So we have new technology with pottery. We have the twilight of atlatl technology. And we also have an increase in production as bison kills are increasing, and we're also seeing an increased size in these dwellings. The next form of material culture that comes in is Avonlea. And this is a tradition that is quite different in terms of pottery, hunting styles, and other activities. We start to see pottery having a distinction in the type of vessels that are being found, and these are somewhat regionalized. There's net and press vessels that look like ones from Minnesota, and there's also parallel grooved vessels that look like ones from further south in South Dakota as well. Then we also have rare examples out here in Alberta. We know a great deal of information about the projectile points and some of the bison kill sites that have been found, but we're still learning a lot more about the ceramics. Bow and arrow technology also comes into play here, which is a big shift from the atlatl technology that was previously seen. And the projectile points reflect this. They become quite small and thin. So these changes really lead us to a lot of questions about this moment of time. We have one hunting style being replaced with another one. We have changes to cooking styles, pottery appearing, and then increasing in the styles that are being produced. We have changes to teepee ring sizes, and the changes in the types and frequencies of community or multi-community kill sites. So there's some questions that we can look at. What do these changes mean? And at the same time, we can also pull on threads that connect everything together, like pottery, which is so infrequent during this time period, but found in such important sites. And when we investigate projectile point technology and we look at pottery, we are actually looking at food production. Projectile point technology is pointing towards the beginning of this cycle of food production in the case of hunting, and pottery could be considered the culmination of all the activities related to food production. So we are actually getting the opportunity to analyze all the connections to the landscape and other cultures through looking at these new forms of technology. So tonight I'm going to look at a few sites. I'll take us to the Stelter site in South Dakota, and then I'll also talk about the Minneota site as well. And I feel that food can really answer a lot of the questions that we're looking at. And if we want to think about food, we can think about ourselves. Food is such a unifying human trait. We all need it, we all like it, we have to consume it, but we all do this in different ways. And this is such a fascinating part of anthropology and archaeology, looking at food decisions and decision-making processes that were being done in the past. We can think about ourselves and we have guests over for dinner. We might cook different foods based on if we like those guests or if we don't. If we're more comfortable with them, craft dinner might suffice for this meal. If we're trying to impress somebody, we might be preparing something else. And the way we present this food might also differ. So we can analyze food and look at this and the questions we ask ourselves today. How is it made? When is it made? How much do we prepare? How often? What are the ingredients and the varieties that we can use? So food is a central component of decision making. And the tools we use for this also varies greatly. And this takes us into culture. And this can go all the way back into the archaeological field of study. We look at researchers like Harry and Frank studying in Alaska, understanding that pottery was a very socially derived culinary process. And in this region of the world, people were focused on hard and soft textures, and also the temperatures of the food as well. Talking to community members and looking at their preferences in food also reveals things that we can apply to the Northern Plains as well, on how there was a preference for some of these original styles of vessels. So for the prairies, we can take a similar approach and look at archaeological sites. And when we tend to think of just bison, we're missing a lot of foods that are available. And foods are really elusive in the archaeological record due to preservation. We look at ethno-historical accounts and research by individuals like Nancy Turner. There's a lot of food options available that we can think of. And with many years of archaeological research, we have been putting together lists of food. But now we really have the opportunity to go and revisit this and put them together and see what some of these residues from archaeological materials will tell us about these people living in these time periods. So since plants and animal food remains don't preserve as well, aside from skeletal tissues, an area we can look at is food residue. We can look at food residue that's attached to the sides of vessels. We've all burnt food before. This is something where some people are quite good at. In the archaeological record, we can look at pottery vessels and we can see where foods have adhered to these vessels. We can remove this carbonized food residue and pick apart microfossils that tell us about plant species that otherwise would not be present at the archaeological site. So these food residues actually grow and accumulate in a vessel as an individual is cooking with them, and you can actually understand the most recent meals prepared within these vessels. We could peel back the layers within the pottery vessels, expose these to chemicals and acids, and identify plant microfossils, isotopes, chemical analyses, lipids, and proteins. We could also do similar work with stone tools. As individuals were working with grinding stones, this is a bell-shaped pestle from the Gull Lake site in Saskatchewan, and there's a large mortar here, or metate, from the Butler Rissler site in Wyoming. And as people were working with stone tools, they're actually, when they're grinding up plant materials, there's little micro fissures present on these items that actually preserve plant microfossils. So we can peel these out as well and understand what plant foods these items were being used for. So my specialty is looking at plant residues and looking at plant microfossils. We can learn a lot from these residues. We can identify plant species like maize or corn based on the type of phytoliths or starch grains that they produce. We can also look at plant microfossils for wild species as well, or locally available plants, like prairie turnip, wild rice, chenopodium, and also several types of berries. These are all things that we wouldn't see in the archaeological record in conventional sites due to preservation. So plant microfossils allows us to open a window into these archaeological pasts and look at cuisine. So over the past several years, I've been working to build a comprehensive paleodietary database, including sites from a wide transect across the Great Plains region. So Besant, Sonota, and Avonlea site types, alongside with other sites from different time periods, representing a considerable amount of data from this region of the plains. And it's always fun working with material collections because you find things you won't expect. And just a few weeks ago, I found a fragment of a vessel in the Miami region of Manitoba that is parallel grooved and shouldn't be in that area, which was interesting to identify. We're always getting surprises. So I'm going to start talking about some of the sites. The Stelzer site is the first one that I'll begin with, and I'll start with the Besant time period, and then I'll move on to the Avonlea. And then there is a final exam or quiz at the end. I'm just kidding. There will be a quiz. You guys can quiz me at the end. So with Besant, the site I'll talk about is the Smithsonian Basin River Survey. And this was a survey done in the 1950s. An individual from Alberta here, John Brumley, who passed away in 2020, was an individual on this project. And what these individuals were doing, they were looking for archaeological sites as a reservoir was being built and would be swallowing up archaeological sites. So as part of the Oahe River Reservoir Survey, they identified many important archaeological sites for this time period. These are some photos of their work in this area. And one site they found was the Stelzer site. And this is a massive gathering of people that occurred roughly 1,700 years ago. The items that they found here were in great numbers. There's a significant number of Besant era projectile points and a significant number of features. This was a single occupation site, and this was a site that was operated over a very short window of time as well. There was also a significant number of exotic items found at this site as well. Copper, Gulf Coast shells, Pacific Coast shells, obsidian, and Knife River flint. And also a lot of pottery, which is really interesting for this time period, as we typically only see maybe 5 vessels at Besant sites. At this site, there was over 20, and these are just the vessels that have been left behind. A lot of these vessels were quite large in size, the largest being about 18 liters. We imagine that, we can think of 9 2-liter bottles of pop, and the amount of food that could be prepared within that. The pottery styles within this time period are also interesting. They're quite varied. There's 11 different design styles found, minimum of 20 vessels overall, 3 forms of surface expression. And this is representing a large assemblage of people at this location. We have 20 instruments at least for preparing a large amount of food for the individuals present at this gathering. We also get to see some really interesting finds as well. So working with clays is something that we've all done before. We notice that our fingerprints are preserved here. And at the Stelzer site, there was a really interesting object identified as the Stelzer clay object. And when looking at the Smithsonian collections, I noticed right away that this is a human fingerprint. So what this fragment is an individual had 2,000 years ago taken a piece of clay, squeezed it between their fingers, and threw it in the fire, perfectly preserving it. With RTI technology, it allows us to get a further detailed image of the fingerprint. And we can do fingerprint analysis on this piece of clay and identify that this is a young woman working with clays at this archaeological site over 2,000 years ago. And this is something when we're looking at archaeological materials we tend to forget about, is the youth present at the site and the children and what they were up to. And this little clay fragment was a reminder of that. The people here potentially working on vessels, cooking food with these vessels and gathering together around these little areas of activity, sharing stories and conducting other activities. The Stelter site and its large size, it's also surrounded by several burial mounds in this area as well, known as the Sonota mounds. So not only was there a lot of material found at the Stelter campsite, but it was also located to several burial mounds as well. While these mounds are reminiscent of ones found further east, there's a strong Northern Plains tradition present in each one. In situ bison remains being buried with individuals, and bundle-style burial, which is common to the Great Plains. There's also a lot of exotic items present within these burial mounds. And as you guessed, pottery. At one site, the Arpan Mound site, there was a single pottery vessel that was encircled with individuals as part of this burial mound, just showcasing the importance of pottery during this time. These were vessels that were being used by communities and likely were able to identify communities one from another, part of their social fabric at the time. It was originally dated to 1850, plus or minus 90 years. And with renewed activity, we were able to identify that it was occupied at the same time as the Stelter site. The radiocarbon dates align nicely with what we're seeing at the Stelter location. It's a location where pottery vessels of a similar style and manufacturing were present. So the people responsible for this vessel were also partaking in the food-related activities at the Stelter site. So the Stelter site is an interesting case for this time period. We're looking at a large pottery assemblage, multiple activity areas, a diverse assemblage of materials, operated over a very short window of time, containing local and exotic materials. But what was going on related to food? So looking at the Stelter residues, the preservation was also fantastic. These are in situ plant microfossils from different grass species that were found with their organic materials still around them, which is quite unique for this field of archaeology. When we think about plants being consumed at this site, we think about corn or maize. In the entire Besant tradition, it's only found at these two locations of all the sites examined for this time period. At the Stelter site, over half of the samples were positive for maize, and the Arpan Mound residues were also positive for maize. This item was playing a key role in the social gatherings at this location, and along with burial practices as well, placing the consumption of maize at a roughly 1,700 years ago. Looking at maize and what's going on for this plant around the world, it's an item that's also new. In the southwest, it is appearing and moving northwards. In the eastern woodlands, we're getting cases and evidence of maize being consumed in these lands. Research at the Schultz site by Adair in 2022 revealed early evidence of maize in this region, in the Central Plains, and the Besant is fitting this narrative of this new food item moving into the areas. And it's being used at such important locations where there's large gatherings of individuals. In Manitoba as well, there's also early sites for this plant. Once it hits North America, people seem to know about it and seem to include it into part of their cuisine. When looking at local plants, there's the same combination of plant foods occurring. Goosefoot or pollen or chenopodium, Saskatoon chokecherry, and other tubers like prairie turnip, showing evidence of locally available plants at each of these sites. So how are they cooking the food? And cuisine and the way we cook things changes over time. But it's also heavily influenced by the trends from outside cultures. The Hopewell interaction sphere, which is driving a lot of material exchange throughout North America, is declining at this time. And we start to see food items arriving into this region of the Northern Great Plains. So by analyzing the pottery residues and the pottery vessels themselves, we can learn how these meals were actually cooked. So looking at cooking techniques, there's a small number of vessels spread out over a vast area. These vessels are quite thick and often were referred to as crude or inefficient. But to really say these things, we have to think about the meals that are being consumed. So we have these very large, thick pottery vessels, and we have to compare this to the foods that are being consumed within them. And something we can look at is the carbon staining on the outside of these pots, showing that the vessels were actually placed beside a fire and not on top of one. This picture here is from a late woodland vessel that Casey Adams provided me, a traditional pottery maker in Manitoba. And you can notice the blackness circling the pottery vessel. For Besant and Sonota, the vessels only have this on one side, showing that the vessels were placed beside a fire. And an interesting thing when looking about the performance of pottery vessels and looking at the thickness is thicker walled vessels, they're not very efficient at getting to a boil, but once they get there, they keep that boil for a long period of time. So it's very useful for simmering foods for a long period. And while we prescribe this as thick or maybe inefficient, and they get narrower or thinner over time as a part of people working with pottery vessels better, we have to really think about the foods going in there. Looking at the plant microfossils, it shows us that a lot of the food is really being heavily boiled. There's a lot of gelatinization in starch grains. These are really melting down. And this occurs when starch grains are exposed to considerable heat over a long period of time. And within this research, we're in Besant and Sonota and the Stelzer site, we're seeing a high number of gelatinization. So overcooking is happening. So we can think about overcooking, or we can think about the food items present and start to really look at these and think about a recipe that we can make today. So with plants, we can look at pottery. We know that chenopodium is a part of this, corn, mixed berries, also hazelnuts as well, and prairie turnip. For animal products, there's bison, fish, freshwater mussel. There are a lot of options here. If this was on our grocery list, there's quite a few meals that we can make. And this is the exciting thing with looking at residues. We can start to put together those recipes. And what we're finding with Besant and Sonota is that there is a repetition happening, especially at the Stelzer site. There's a high frequency of maize, chenopodium, and berries being found together. And this actually matches some descriptions in ethnohistorical records of meals that were prepared. Most notably was how chenopodium is prepared. It's an interesting plant where you would boil it, remove the water, boil it again, remove the water, and then potentially boil it again. So this repetitive boiling would result in gelatinized starch grains, which is what we're seeing in the archaeological record. Thicker walled vessels would be very efficient at performing this task. And then looking at some Hopi descriptions of ceviche, or a morning porridge, involved chenopodium, mixed berries, and also corn or maize, combining these three together. So at the Stelzer site, we have all of these ingredients here. We have all of these vessels that are thick, large. They hold a boil for a long period of time, meaning you could leave them to a boil for a long period and not worry about them or adding more heat to them. And if you're cooking porridge, this seems to make sense. These two go together quite well. So with Besant-based pottery, what we're seeing is a limited number of pottery vessels, but they're showing up at sites that are so significant. Burials, gatherings of people, large bison kill sites, these are the locations we tend to see these vessels. We can also think of the size of these vessels, some of them being upwards of 20 liters in capacity, giving us the potential for many people to be fed from a single pot. If we were to estimate a porridge and maybe 250 milliliters or a cup represents one serving size. In one of these vessels, 90 to 140 individuals could share that meal. So when we think about 20 vessels being found at this site, imagine how many people were actually there gathering together, participating in the other activities around the site. So we have these vessels that have the capacity to feed an entire community and being placed behind with community members as well. When Avonlea comes along, 1600 to about roughly 900 years ago, we start to see zones of these pottery vessels show up. It's not a variation of style throughout an entire region. We get parallel groove vessels, net and press styles, and they are quite distinct for each region, even though the decorations might differ. So now we'll go through Avonlea and see what the differences are there. These are also large pottery vessels, slightly thinner. They're found in a higher abundance, but still infrequent. Well, what foods are being found there as well? For one site, I'll take a moment to look at a different period of time. We'll look at the Minneota site, dating to around 1320 years BP. This is a winter-spring campsite along the Assiniboine River that was actually flooded. There's over 1 meter of material placed on the archaeological site, which resulted in it being well preserved. There was a large central hearth feature and pottery present. Multiple vessels being found at this site, but one style, net and pressed vessels. We're not seeing a variation like we see in Stelzer. This is the location in the 90s where the excavation happened. Right here where a pipeline was going through the landscape. Preservation was quite high at the site. Here is a bone needle that was found at this location. And here is also wolf willow beads that were found in really good preservation, and an individual managed to make a replica of this, imagining it as a necklace, which sheds more light on the people behind this location, the vibrancy of the material culture, the colors present here. Going to the Minneota site today, just recently, the site is incredibly diverse in biodiversity. It's right beside the Assiniboine River, which has a rich history in these lands. There's other sites nearby this location. On the other side of the valley there is a teepee ring circle site. And at the forefront here, we have bushes that are just filled with chokecherry, raspberries, and other berry types. And with pottery vessels, there were quite a bit of residue to examine as well. So looking at the residues, we see a change. With Besant and Sonota, there was a limited number of sites containing maize. Within Avonlea, there's an abundance. The Minneota site had presence of maize in the soils, hearth features, pottery, and stone tools. And then we look at other sites from this area like Chauvel in Saskatchewan. There's pottery, stone tools, and fire-cracked rock as well. Gives us the feeling that maize is really no longer a new thing. It's something that is entering daily consumption. It's still likely acquired through trade, but it's something that is part of a cuisine that is less restricted. Also, beans and squash were identified. Looking at locally available plants, where it's Besant and Sonota, we have this repetition of berries and chenopodium. We see quite a variety in the types of plants that are found. There's types of tubers, types of berries, and many wild plant taxa being found at this location. We're seeing a diversity of locally available plants being combined with domesticated food products that have been acquired through trade with outside lands. Gelatinization was also noted, but not to the extent that we see in Besant and Sonota. Another interesting thing was wild rice within Avonlea, which was quite a surprise looking at samples from this time period. The research shows that wild rice was also widely consumed, and dispersed throughout this time period. These are wild rice microfossils here, giving us an indication of people consuming and preparing wild rice that requires to be boiled in large pottery vessels as well. Looking at wild rice, it's an interesting plant to think about because there's a lot of options on where it came from. If we're looking at Avonlea culture zones based on material culture, there's also laurel to the north in the boreal forest area where wild rice is present. And there's also Elk Lake traditions to the southeast in Minnesota where obviously wild rice is present. And then in historical records, Fiddler notes in the early time period in Manitoba that wild rice was growing on parts of the Red River and also by Brandon House as well. So if we try to trace apart where wild rice is coming from, it could be people collecting it in the plains or interacting with peoples to the north and to the southeast. With Avonlea, we also see evidence of medicinal plants being consumed. Some of these plants have medicinal properties, and they also have raphides, which are crystalline structures that are also microfossil in size. These are crystals that can be an impediment to digestion if you were to eat them raw, but they're being found in pottery vessels that are boiling foods. So individuals have this knowledge of the plant foods and are boiling plant foods and removing these items. So Avonlea food residue actually contains starch grains from these plants and these little inedible raphides as well, showing that extensive cooking was happening and people had the knowledge to prepare these plants properly. When we look at Avonlea pottery uses, there's a variation as well, but it's occurring within each region. We see the vessels that are net and pressed are having plant foods that reflect that local environment. When we look at parallel groove vessels that are in the open prairie, they're also reflecting this environment as well, open prairie sites, which is quite different from Besant and Avonlea, where there's a similarity across the entire region. So what we're looking at here when we map out the pottery vessels, we're seeing trends in cuisine that are more regional. It's not as, it's more restricted within these cultural zones. So returning back to that question, the changes that are happening during this time, atlatl projectile points are being replaced by bow and arrow, cord roughened pottery vessels, that there's quite a variation across the region, being replaced with multiple types of pottery vessels that are geographically restricted. TP ring sizes are increasing, and the number of large communal bison kill sites are increasing as well. And what we're finding is the cuisine component to this. We're finding that maize is being limited to special occasions at first, the Stelzer and the Arpan Mound site. And then over time, this restriction eases. And we're seeing it in winter campsites, at other habitation sites, and non-massive gathering sites. So there's changes happening. So pottery use is limited, and then it becomes more frequent. But how people are using those in those areas are reflecting cultural identities. We start with porridge-style meals that require slow boiling and simmering, and we get this expanded into a diversity of locally available plants combined with those that are traded. And this intergeographic exchange is being reflected in the pottery residues. So what we can now map out looking at cuisine is just the changes in influence that's happening over time. Material culture is expanding onto the Northern Great Plains. New things are learned. They're showing up in different areas. And the source areas for this new influence in technology is changing as well. With Besant and looking at pottery, this is often tied to Nebraska and the Central Plains, part of Kansas City, Hopewell. These pottery vessels look quite similar. There's also less variation in the style of pottery vessels. When we look at Avonlea, we see two different zones instead of just one. There's Truman-style vessels, which expand on to the Northern Great Plains with parallel groove vessels, but also ones that look like Brainerd, the net and press vessels, that are sticking and clinging to these more aspen parkland-prone environments. So during the time of Besant, we're seeing an influence relating to pottery and non-local foods that was quite small, and it quickly decreases in frequency the further away from centers where this is more common, such as Valley or the Central Plains. Coinciding with this increase In social posturing, we have large teepee rings and ramping up of large bison kill sites, which may potentially be competition, as some individuals like Smith have suggested. Or we're seeing reflection of social organization, where there is greater first amongst equals and organization of societal power. During the time of Avonlea, influence relating to pottery and non-local foods is different, with an increased number of pottery-bearing sites and in different styles. These pottery vessels are being used to prepare a greater diversity of foods, including more non-local items, and we see a shrinking of influence zones, suggesting that social organization continues to be more diverse during this time period as compared to Besant and Sonota. So rather than a full replacement of people, we can imagine this as zones of influence and new materials being learned and exchanged. And in some cases, there will be a restriction to new things that come out. So we can look at material culture changes as a reflection of local groups and decision-making processes regarding food production, the choice of food items, pottery design, and also being done that fits their social organization. So from Besant and Sonota to Avonlea, we're seeing canoidal pots that were refined over time into 4 separate design styles with little resemblance to Besant and Sonota. Avonlea vessels would continue to play a minor role in the overall material culture, but again were left behind in burials and also used to prepare maize that was acquired via long-distance trade. While Avonlea vessels would play a relatively minor technological role, by now the pottery tradition was persistent and was the subject of intergenerational transmission. This includes situations where one variant, like Etheridge ware, continues across Avonlea to Old Woman's Face into the transition of the Northern Great Plains. So there's so much more work to be done when we look at these time periods. Pottery, although infrequent during this time, first played an important symbolic role in Northern Great Plains cultures. We can think about these large pottery vessels, the fact that you can decorate them, prepare food in them, and also use it as a means to showcase these meals. And you're gathering with people. You can think of these large pottery vessels being placed out, owned by a community to show other communities your identity and the foods going in there. So we can apply this research into museum collections, CRM collections, and surface collections to aid our understanding of how cuisine changes over time. We have the ability to examine highly perishable items via residues, and also heal wounds between communities and share this knowledge and information. Prepare some of the foods on these landscapes that were as they were done thousands of years ago. And facing food security issues and changes to climate, we can learn more about how people adapted and gained insight into food security problems that may have been faced in the past. We're seeing an increased use of pottery domesticates over time, and this does not disappear. Maize and other domesticated plants continue to be used over time on the prairies. So where can we go next? So part of this, with all of this data, we can further learn about the cooking processes, cook the meals that were found in these vessels. So part of this task that I'm working on right now is working with traditional pottery maker Casey Adams, preparing vessels that are replicas to ones in the past and cooking foods with them. We can recreate these meals and then analyze what happens in the cooking process. How long does it take to make these meals? What was the aromas, the smells? What other things can we learn about it that we wouldn't learn from the residues of the pot itself? We can learn about what happens to those starch grains to tell us more and give us more interpretations on cooking from archaeological residues. We can also evaluate other moments in time as well. We're not just limited to pottery vessels. We can look at other traditions that did not make pottery but still had culinary practices. We can look at stone boiling, open hearth cooking, and we can also look at projectile points and stone tools as well. And learn more about those traditions and start filling in some of the gaps, as food is such a central part of decision-making processes that were done in the past all the way through to the present. So we can look at Oxbow, McKee, Pelican Lake, look at those traditions and then really think about how food gathering was done. as we often have focused on projectile points. And another thing we can focus on is looking at gathering more radiocarbon dates, especially as we look at transitions from one material culture to another. Increasing the number of solid radiocarbon dates we have tells us if this transition between Besant and Avonlea was a quick one or one that took many generations to occur. So as archaeologists, it's our job to tell stories about how the past was done with the data that we collect from the field. And this research really highlights what we can really learn from those connections. As we pick up items from the ground, think about the things that were connected to it, the decision-making processes that led to that item being left where it was today. Thank you, everybody.